go back to parts of the world that we no longer include in our Western civilization, namely Egypt and Iraq. Wouldn't it have been better if the earliest civilization had been in Europe? Now, how cool would that be? Then the Europeans could say, we're at the origin point of civilization. Now, that happens to be true. It appears that, let's say, if you go back to 4000 BC or 3800 BC, which is a good 500 years before the earliest things that we call cities in Iraq, the beginnings of Sumerian civilization. The largest human settlement in the world apparently was in Romania, made up entirely of gymnasts. It's amazing. Now, it was in Romania, very much in the valley, not of the Tigris and Euphrates or of the Nile, but of the Danube River. And this civilization, you had one community there that is estimated to have had 5,000 inhabitants, about double the size of the Sumerian cities when they come to be built, and in sort of great arcs of houses that seem to be organized in a certain form. But this wasn't known back when the theory was being established. Now, this civilization is recognized, and it is called Old Europe. You will not find any reference to Old Europe in Chapter 1 of The Earth and Its Peoples. Not my fault that I didn't draft that chapter, but our ancient historian felt that, how do you tell the story of the great river valley civilizations that give rise to civilization if you have to start with Romania? Because the civilization in Romania, Old Europe, is dead by 3500 BC. Instead of it going on and giving rise to empires and codes of law and religions and so forth and so on, it began, it flourished, it ended. And it was in a river valley, which is raises a great problem, because the standard narrative requires the reader to believe that civilization, once it starts, is kind of self-propagating. And you can see it spread, and you can see it increase in complexity. So what was going on in Old Europe, and why didn't we know? Well, of course, when you go back to the 19th century, and you look at the areas that were involved, which were primarily Romania, Bulgaria, and the southernmost parts of Ukraine, this was a very unsettled and warlike period. It was a period of the decline of the Ottoman Empire, rise of very parochial nationalisms among the various peoples of Southeast Europe. It really wasn't a good time to simply go out with a shovel and start digging up in someone's village. So that was one reason, perhaps, that people never noticed this civilization. There would also be the question of, if you found something, how did you get permission to take it to your museum? Because who was the government? The government. And that could be a problem. It turns out that Old Europe was not suspected to exist as a civilization until the Soviet period. Following World War II. Between the end of World War II and the end of the Soviet Union, there was a massive archaeological enterprise in Southeast Europe, Russia, southern Russia, and Ukraine to dig up mounds. There are zillions of mounds in that area, just like the Middle East, but they hadn't been dug up before. There wasn't any tradition that there had once been a civilization there. And when they were dug up, the findings were published in Russian and Romanian and published by local academies of sciences in books and articles that were not read by Western archaeologists. They also were books and articles that were predicated upon Marxist theories of the development of human society, which were very different from those that prevailed among Western archaeologists. So when the Soviet Union fell, there was a particular time and place where a handful of archaeologists were invited from Russia to come to an archaeological convention in the United States and to talk about what they and their colleagues have been doing for the last 2 generations. And lo and behold, they said, we have found a civilization that is incredibly complex and that has the oldest layers going back to well before parallel developments that you have in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. But it came to an end. Even then, this did not have the impact that it might have had if all the writings had been translated into Western languages. There simply weren't that many archaeologists working in the West who could read Russian excavation reports. You also had to have the freedom to go to the site and go to the museums and look at the collections. So it is only now that the great accumulation of archaeological knowledge from the Soviet era is being melded into the thinking of European archaeologists. One of the leading centers for publicizing this is the Center for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, and they had an exhibition last spring of the archaeology of old Europe, and a number of publications related to that. This center is run by our former colleague here at Columbia, Roger Bagnall. But the easiest place to get access to this is a book by David Anthony called, is it called the name that David Anthony gave it? Language, Horses. Anyway, I'll get it for you, and Nathan will email it to you. It's a stunning book because it tells you that everything you thought you knew about the beginnings of civilization has to be modified. How long it will take for it to trickle down into textbooks, I don't know, but when it does, it will raise the question of why the growth of dense human settlements based on grain agriculture did not succeed in perpetuating itself in Southeast Europe, while it did in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Not only that, but it turns out that while old Europe has roots that go back, or offshoots, I should say, that go up the Danube River toward further into Europe, as you move east across the northern edge of the Black Sea, let's say, here's the Black Sea, and here's the Caspian Sea, here's the Caucasus Mountains, you've got a little connection here, and here's the Aegean Sea that connects to the Mediterranean Sea. There are great issues having to do with this area. One of them is the hydrology of the area. The Danube flows into the Black Sea. Then the Dniester flows into the Black Sea. Then the Bug. Then the Dnieper. Then the Don. And you have a whole bunch. And then over here, you have the Volga and the Ural. These rivers flow from north to south across Central Asia and Russia and Ukraine, and empty into the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. That was not always the case. It appears that when you go back to glacial times, when northern Europe was buried under vast quantities of ice, these rivers didn't flow in this direction. It's when you get the melting of the ice, which is around 12,000 BC, the last ice age, that the weight of the ice as it melts, the disappearance of that weight allows the land to sort of spring back. And so these rivers start to flow into the Black Sea and the Caspian in larger amounts. But during the Ice Age, the sea level fell so much that the Black Sea was not connected with the world's oceans. And in fact, the Black Sea appears to have been a fairly shallow lake. If you go back further into the ice ages, you'll find that the Mediterranean Sea was almost dry. When you look at cross sections of the Nile Valley, you see that, here you have the Nile flows in the Mediterranean, but if you look at the cross section, you find that at one time, instead of flowing into the sea here, it was flowing through a very deep canyon to get down to the level of the Mediterranean Sea, because the Mediterranean Sea was almost dry. And what you have now, places like Cyprus and Crete, Sicily, islands in the Mediterranean were once mountaintops. And it helps explain why you have certain species of animals that get isolated on these islands and are left over from the time when you could walk across the area that becomes the Mediterranean Sea. So you get like dwarf elephants in Cyprus. Elephants that were stranded on what became an island and gradually became, 3 or 4 feet tall instead of 12 feet tall. But that was long, long ago. The issue of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea may go back to around 5,000 BC. In other words, within the same very broad time horizon of when the old European civilization came into being. And you have different theories. 2 scholars at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the Columbia Center for Studying Oceanography and all aspects of geology, that's located across the river just north of the George Washington Bridge. 2 scholars there, Pittman and his colleague, the gentleman who's not Pittman, they wrote a book called Noah's Flood. See, I remember some titles. Noah's Flood says that sometime around maybe 5,500 BC, something happened that allowed the water from the Aegean and the Mediterranean to break through at this level and to fill the Black Sea. And their argument is that great filling of the bathtub is what came in legend to be called Noah's Flood. because at the time that the Black Sea was filling up, on the northern edges of the Black Sea, you had people who were growing wheat and barley on low-lying land, and they gradually were flooded out, and they all had to leave. There's a very controversial thesis. You have some people who hold to it very strongly on a number of technical grounds, and some people who dispute it on technical grounds. You have a similar argument saying that something here called the Caspian Depression, at one point the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea were linked together, and then the sea levels changed and the link between them disappeared. So there's a lot of controversy. Unlike the Nile, where there is broad agreement that that is the river, and that's where the river has been, and that's where the river is going to stay, and you could pretty much count on there being a Nile River there. It doesn't mean that there weren't other rivers in North Africa. It's just that all the others dried up and only the Nile survived. The dryness of North Africa, the dryness of the Sahara Desert, reached the maximum at which it is still situated around 2500 BC. Before that, it was moister, and instead of having desert from Egypt to the Atlantic Ocean, you had grassland, and in some areas probably savanna forest. If you fly over the Sahara Desert, you can see the river valleys in the most dramatic way. You can say, there was a great waterfall. There's where two rivers flow together. And what you see now is simply rivers of sand. The water has all disappeared. But the Nile, because it connected with water sources in Central Africa, the Nile survived. Same thing with the Tigris and Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates have been there, changing their beds somewhat over thousands of years, but by and large they have been there all the way along, and the water there, unlike in the Nile where it comes from Central Africa, the water there comes from the snowfall in Turkey that melts and flows into the Tigris and the Euphrates valleys that go through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq and end up in the Persian Gulf. Now, that hydrology, in other words, is one where you can say, we know where the rivers were, and we can see the whole area getting drier over time. But up here, it's controversial. You know, what constituted a river system or an agricultural system along a lake? Was the water in the lake, sweet water or saline? What is the situation there? The linkage between Old Europe and the broad hydrology of the region hasn't really been thoroughly worked out at this time. However, Old Europe is from here over, and to say from the Don River to the westward. None of that wheat and barley cultivation extends over here. And when you get over here, Central Asia, east of the Volga River and the Ural River, you don't even get any people to speak of. I mean, it's just foragers. So there was a clustering in this direction in where these various river valleys were, and that is where the old European civilization is located. Now, as I say, if this had been known in the 19th century, European historians fixated upon the history of Western civilization would have said civilization began with white Europeans in Romania and was borrowed by the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, who really weren't quite white enough to qualify as Europeans. this kind of thinking is linked to a school of theorizing known as diffusionism. Diffusionism is based on the idea that it is more likely that something will happen once and spread than that it will happen in a similar or identical fashion in different places that are not connected with each other. One of the great areas of controversy, both in archaeology and in history, is what do you do when you see a phenomenon that occurs in different areas? The diffusionists usually say that there must be a single point of origin and that everything spreads from there. This is really why we have this concept of Western civs starting in Egypt and Mesopotamia, is that the earliest place has to be the place from which everything else spread. Diffusionism is not nonsense, but it has to be looked at very carefully. When it comes to the question of Old Europe, this is a hot debate. One of the dominant theories about the end of Old Europe by one of the first archaeologists to show that this had been a dynamic civilization by 4000 BC, Maria Gimbutas, she said that this civilization was destroyed by horse-riding, mace-wielding, chariot-driving warriors from the east. And of course, there's a corollary that Old Europe is seen in this theory as being matriarchal, that because we have many little figurines, thousands of little figurines of pregnant or at least overweight females, and then we stop having those. So it's the idea that the beastly, heavily armed, testosterone-driven men and their chariots and horses came in and destroyed the peace-loving matriarchal women of Southeast Europe who had actually created civilization, and then it got stolen from them, because that's just what men do. They're just beastly. David Anthony, who's written the book, the name of which I can't remember, goes into this argument in quite some detail because he's particularly interested in the origin of these horse riders and chariot drivers, and particularly of the relation of horse riding and chariot driving to the Indo-European languages. And this goes into another chapter in this sort of big history story of you have archaeology, you have study of bones, of implements, of climate change, and you have language. And this is one of the hardest things to deal with in a world historical context, because to study language it kind of means you have to know some language, and generally we can make no assumptions about foreign languages. In particular, there's a question of when does language arise, and why does it get divided up geographically and by social group in the way that it comes to be divided up. Oh, I know, okay, Tower of Babel, that explains it all. But it really is a a problem, and it's a problem that relates to not simply the surviving evidence of language and language difference, but also to scientific theories about how language comes to be produced. Now, here, the most controversial argument has been that syntax, the ability to link sounds together in a meaningful fashion, which is seen to be essential to define a language. That syntax comes about because of a genetically established capacity of the human brain that no other animal has. And this is the idea of a syntax gene or a language gene. Noam Chomsky is the primary author of this theory, who was almost unquestionably the most famous and brilliant American scholar of linguistics before he switched to left-wing polemic writing, where he is now America's perhaps foremost and most brilliant writer of left-wing polemics. But nevertheless, Chomsky's notion of the language gene encountered the question of the physical capacity to create language. In other words, the great apes, who are our closest relatives, do not have a physical capacity to create linguistic sounds or modulate them in their throat or their lips and so forth to create speech. So at some point you have a physical capacity that comes into being, and according to Chomsky, at some point you have a genetic capacity to make use of the physical capacity. Now, one could argue that the physical capacity to make the sounds must have come first, because it would be sort of silly to have a syntax gene and say, you know, I really want to recite the Iliad now, if you couldn't make the sounds. So I had a conversation with one of our anthropologists who's made his reputation on studies of the brain and the physiology of the skull, and we talked about this, and he said, well, chimpanzees can have the physical capacity to hum. Have the physical capacity to hum, but they don't. And that was sort of interesting. You know, you go, bananas, but they don't choose to. As if he was saying, well, there was a physical capacity, but the will wasn't there. Then you get to the debate over Neanderthals, humans from before 40,000 BC. Could they speak? And you get disagreements on that. One of the interesting findings of archaeology in Neolithic and Neanderthal sites has been a small number of flutes. First there was one, then two, now there have been several. These are bones that are perforated with the perforations spaced in such a way that you could play it as a flute. Initially,